I do not recommend standing behind a church pulpit and trying to preach a sermon while on the inside you're seething with anger. I may have done that before, once. It was early in my church career, and I was serving with a church that had recently sold its historic landmark church building downtown, and they had moved out to the suburbs to try and get a fresh start. So during my first 2 years there, we held worship services in a double-wide trailer while we were building our new building. And in that small worship space, we kept a huge antique Bible in a book stand down on the communion table. Well, finally, opening day came for our new building. I went in early to put my notes up on the new pulpit in the new sanctuary, and I found that someone had left that huge antique Bible spread open on the pulpit. There was no place for me to put my sermon notes, so I did the only logical thing I could think of. I went and I found that book stand, and I moved the Bible back on the communion table where it had been for every Sunday the last 2 years. Well, 15 minutes before the grand opening service was to begin, I was confronted in the hallway by one of our deacons. He pointed his finger in my face, and he literally spit out all these angry words at me for moving that Bible. My wife and my children were watching with wide eyes through the window of the nursery, and I was literally stunned. I had no words. After he stormed away, I could feel the anger swelling up inside of me. But I had no time to process it. Grand opening. So, filled with anger, I threw up a desperate prayer. And somehow I made it through that worship service. I don't even remember a word I said during that sermon. Church can be a painful place. Sometimes it's the things that are said inside the church family that are the most hurtful. We spend so much energy trying to follow the path of conflict avoidance that we end up letting the bitterness build up underneath the surface until it spills over into this harmful, hurtful speech. Well, the good news is that Jesus actually told us how to handle conflict like this. We just need to learn to follow it. So, since I've been doing this series on the lost art of friend making, let me start with a word from Proverbs, chapter 27, verse 6. It says, "Faithful are the wounds of a friend, profuse are the kisses of an enemy." A true friend is going to work through conflicts and offenses. But the people who only give you compliments and never even try to talk through the hard stuff, conflict avoidance, they often end up being the ones who tear you down in the end. But there is a way to work through conflict biblically as friends, or as Jesus puts it in Matthew 18, as brothers and sisters. I believe every church ought to hold training seminars in these 3 verses from Matthew 18, verses 15 through 17. Jesus said, "If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take 1 or 2 others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile or a tax collector." So look at how Jesus begins. First off, in verse 15, if your brother sins against you, the first truth we need to accept is offense happens. Later in this chapter, Peter comes up to Jesus in verses 21 and 22, and he asks him, "Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, "I do not say to you 7 times, but 70 times 7. I can imagine, when Peter came and asked Jesus that question, Jesus did not say, Peter, 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 this is the church, my kingdom. People won't sin against you that many times. People will love you and respect you." No. Jesus basically said, Peter, that's cute that you imagine people might sin against you only 7 times. Actually, they'll just keep sinning against you and keep sinning against you. You won't believe how many times people in the kingdom will let you down, and you need to be prepared for it. And that's what this lesson from Jesus is about. We need to learn how to live in community with a bunch of fellow sinners. Okay, so verse 15. If your brother sins against you, what do you do about it? Well, first off, you don't just stuff it and let it fester. Go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. You need to take the initiative and confront the offense. Don't wait for the other person to come groveling to you, but listen for the goal of the confrontation. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. What's the Christ-like goal of confronting sin in someone else? It's not to humiliate them. It's not to punish them. It's not to prove that you are the one in the right. The goal is to gain your brother or sister. The goal of having those hard conversations when you confront someone for how you feel that they have wronged you is always to restore your relationship. And we must start by confronting a person privately. Resist the urge to talk to others about it. This is one of the most neglected commands of Jesus in our churches. If your goal is the restoration of your relationship, then give your brother or sister the respect of dealing with your conflict one-on-one, face-to-face. It takes courage, but it is a protection for the whole community. Then Jesus says in verse 16, but if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. Again, why are we bringing 1 or 2 people with us after we've tried to work through it privately? Well, it's for the sake of truth. Sometimes we need help to heal a broken relationship. And only after those first 2 steps do we come to verse 17. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. For the purity of the community, if an erring brother does not listen to godly rebuke, we must treat our brother as he is acting, like someone who's not part of the community of God's kingdom. And we need to remember this is not talking about just having a disagreement over the styles of music in the worship service. This is talking about willful sin that a person refuses to confess and turn away from. But the message isn't over. What's the rest of the chapter about? Forgiveness. Conflict is a reality of life. So Jesus is teaching us a couple of essential things about keeping our relationships healthy, in light of the fact that we are constantly dealing with conflicts and offenses, both perceived and actual. The thing we often miss is that God expects us to move toward one another and pursue reconciliation. So I'm going to give you a 4-step process for how to handle conflict in a Christ-like way. The first thing you need to do, is to get on your knees and ask the Lord to remind you of all the things that he has done to forgive you. Remember how much God has forgiven you. The second thing you need to do is decide what your goal is in your relationship with this person. Do you want them to suffer for their offenses, or do you want to heal your relationship with them? Decide right now that your goal is restoration of relationship. 3, take the initiative to try to heal and restore your relationship. And this works both ways, whether you're the offended or the offender. Seek your brother or sister in private. Don't talk about it with other people until you've tried to talk directly with them. And even then, don't talk with other people unless they are going to try to help you get healed and reconciled. Seek restoration. The 4th and final step is the one that we often forget. Set them free from their debt, just like God set you free from your debt. Forgive them. And back to my story. I called up that deacon later that afternoon on that Sunday, and he was willing to talk. He was so embarrassed. He apologized profusely for his outburst. And I learned from him that the antique Bible had been the pulpit Bible in the historic landmark church sanctuary for decades. And the previous pastor, the one who was before me, he had pushed so hard to make so many changes. A lot of church members felt a great sense of loss about their identity as a church. And he was afraid that I was ramping up for more fights to get my way and force them to lose more of their identity as a church. And he finally realized that I didn't know any of that history. So I forgave him. But our relationship was changed. I couldn't trust him anymore. The wound was healing, but the scars remained, and I was afraid he would have another outburst for another misunderstanding. Well, a couple of months later, on New Year's Day, he invited me to his house, and we sat down face to face, and we talked it all out. I was so proud of him, because that day, he walked through Matthew 18 with me, and we became brothers again. Do you realize how much heartache and division we would avoid if we were all willing to walk through Matthew 18 in the ways that we deal with conflict? It really is true. God's word has all the wisdom you need for every day.